In July of 1915, the Irish Catholic mayor of Boston, John Honey Fitzgerald, looked upon his firstborn grandson and declared with pride, quote, "This child is the future president of the United States." Honey Fitz was correct that his grandson would grow up to be president, but his firstborn boy, who would be named Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. after his father, was not the child destined for the Oval Office. Instead, it was fated to be the second-born, and Honey Fitz's namesake, John Fitzgerald, who would reach political immortality, while Joe would largely disappear from history. This is the story of how the rivalry between the two oldest Kennedy brothers shaped the siblings, and how this decades-long game of brotherly one-upmanship led both boys to acts of heroism in World War II, but ultimately ended in tragedy. Joseph Kennedy Jr. and John F. Kennedy, who would go by Jack for most of his life, were born less than 2 years apart. Their multimillionaire father, Joe Kennedy Sr., was absent for long stretches of their childhood, and so Joe Jr. became a de facto parent to his 8 younger siblings. He taught his brothers and sisters everything from sailing to playing football and baseball. For most of their childhood, it was not hard to see why Joe Jr. was the boy who carried the family's high expectations. While Joe was healthy, strong, and athletic, Jack was frail and frequently ill. Joe's personality was also similar to their father's, while Jack was more independent and rebellious. Eventually, both sons followed in their father's academic footsteps and attended Harvard. However, it was Jack who outshined his older brother when he became the first Catholic ever admitted into one of Harvard's elite final clubs. This social defeat by his younger brother stung Joe Jr. deeply. The sibling rivalry between Joe Jr. and Jack intensified as World War II drew closer. Their father was named the U.S. ambassador to Britain in 1938, at a time when tensions in Europe were rising. Joe Sr. firmly believed that a war with Nazi Germany would be ultimately unwinnable for the Western Allies, and it led him to play an important role in Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Hitler and to promote isolationism back in America.
War is the work of men, and being the work of men is not inevitable. There is plenty of evidence to show that those on whom the final decision rests are fully alive to the consequences that would devolve not only upon those who did the actual fighting, but upon the civil population. And in the final analysis, upon the foundations of civilization itself.
One of the men who convinced Joe Sr. that a war with Nazi Germany needed to be avoided at all costs was actually the famous pilot Charles Lindbergh. He had traveled to Germany in 1938, where he had been manipulated into believing that the strength of the Nazi air power was significantly greater than it actually was. Lindbergh used his fame to convince Joe Sr., along with many other Americans, that the Nazis would easily be victorious if a war started.
And I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England, regardless of how much assistance we send.
Joe Jr. adopted his father's views, and isolationism became the platform of his first political career. After his father was removed from his post as ambassador, Joe Jr. officially began the process of publicly taking up his father's political mantle, even acting as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1940 and casting his vote against FDR. Meanwhile, Jack used the access and opportunities that came with his father's role as ambassador to develop his own unique worldview, rejecting isolationism. His observations from traveling to Europe during the pre-war years would develop into his senior thesis, and eventually be published as the best-selling book, Why England Slept, when Jack was only 22. And here we have the sibling rivalry again. Joe Jr. also had dreams of stepping into national prominence by writing a book, but none of his writings were ever accepted by publishers. Once again, his little brother had passed him by. Despite the isolationist beliefs, Joe Jr. left law school in order to enlist as a Navy pilot in 1941. As a naval aviator, Joe found his first real success in life. He served 2 tours leading bombing campaigns against Nazi submarines and completed 25 dangerous combat missions. By all accounts, he was a genuinely gifted pilot. However, just as he was becoming eligible to return home, Jack would enter the headlines again for an act of heroism that outshined anything Joe Jr. had achieved during his service. Wildly jealous, Joe volunteered for a dangerous mission that would give him accolades to match his younger brother. But this mission would cost him his life. Before we tell the story of Joe Jr.'s final mission, we need to share the famous story of Jack's heroism on PT Boat 109. While Joe Jr. was flying missions over the Atlantic, Jack Kennedy was on the other side of the world serving in the Pacific Theater. Jack had a chronic bad back and an assortment of other medical issues, so it had taken help from Joe Sr.'s political connections to get Jack into the Navy. Nonetheless, in early 1943, he was given command over a 12-man motor torpedo crew on what was known as a PT boat. These small attack boats were around 80 feet in length and operated primarily at night. They were designed to strike undetected and sink Japanese warships. For the first 4 months of his time as leader of PT-109, Jack failed to distinguish himself as a particularly skilled officer. But then one night in August, disaster struck and he would seize the opportunity to forever change his military legacy. PT-109 had been idling in open water near the Solomon Islands. Suddenly, one of the sailors caught sight of a 2,000-ton Japanese destroyer named Amagiri headed directly at the boat. Kennedy ordered the crew to turn towards the Japanese ship and fire, but the engines had been muffled and the maneuver failed. The destroyer slammed into the PT boat, cutting it in half and instantly killing 2 of the sailors. Jack ordered the rest of the men to abandon ship, and they all jumped into the water. All around them, the sea was lit with flaming gasoline from the ruptured boat. The men were scattered, and one of the men, a machinist named Paul McMahon, was badly burned. Kennedy took control of the situation, gathering the men before ordering them to swim to an island 4 miles in the distance. The men swam for 5 hours, with Kennedy towing the injured McMahon by gripping the strap of the man's life jacket in his teeth until the crew finally reached the beach. For 6 days, the sailors hid out in a series of uninhabited islands, surviving on coconuts and avoiding detection by Japanese patrols. Occasionally, Jack would leave the group to swim back into the dangerous waters in search of help. Finally, they were found by a pair of native New Zealand coast watchers who were working with the Allies. Jack carved a message on a piece of coconut that the coast watchers delivered to the Allied troops. The maneuver worked, and the men were rescued. The strip of coconut would be saved and eventually turned into a paperweight that sat on Kennedy's desk in the Oval Office. Though the incident and the 2 sailors' death could have been blamed on Kennedy's failures as a commander, it was decided that the nation needed heroes and Kennedy fit the bill. Rather than being disciplined, he was awarded the Navy and Marine Medal for his efforts in the rescue, along with the Purple Heart for his injuries. A few months later, the New Yorker published an account of the PT-109 rescue. As Jack's fame spread across the country, it also reached Joe Jr., who could not stand playing second fiddle to his increasingly famous kid brother. An interesting note, John Hershey, the man who wrote the New Yorker article, was actually convinced to do so by his wife, who was a serious ex-girlfriend of Jack's. The article brought Hershey into the national spotlight, and soon after, he would transform journalism with his famous account of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Jealous of Jack's fame, Joe sought his own heroism and volunteered for increasingly dangerous missions, until he finally joined the operation that would claim his life. This mission, which was part of Operation Aphrodite, was both technologically innovative and also completely reckless. The target of the operation was a series of heavily fortified Nazi rocket launch sites scattered across the French coast. The Germans had been using these sites to launch newly developed rockets called V-weapons into Britain. These weapons were completely self-guided, making them the first ballistic missiles ever deployed. They terrified the British public. The Allies tried to destroy the launch sites with conventional bombs, but the bunkers were too deep underground to be affected by the blasts. To counter these fortifications, Allied commanders took a page from the kamikaze pilots in the Pacific and decided to turn the planes themselves into enormous bombs. In the process, Operation Aphrodite developed what were essentially some of the world's first drones. Here's how the operation was designed to work. An outdated B-17 bomber would be modified and loaded with thousands of pounds of explosives. A second bomber would fly behind and guide the unmanned craft through radio controls. While remaining in the skies, the second bomber could direct the loaded B-17 towards a ground target, finally crashing the plane and its explosive payload into the target. However, there was a catch. A pilot was still needed to take off in the loaded B-17 and set it on course. At its highest altitude, the pilot would then parachute out of the bomber, allowing the second plane to take control. This task, flying a defective bomber through enemy fire while sitting on top of thousands of pounds of unstable explosives, was exactly the job Joe Jr. volunteered for in August of 1944. On that summer day, Joe took to the skies, destined to never land. The takeoff went smoothly, but just as Joe and his co-pilot were preparing to evacuate the bomber, faulty electrical wiring caused the explosives to ignite. The plane exploded into a gigantic fireball blown apart from the inside. Pieces of the bomber landed hundreds of miles away, but no trace of Joe or his co-pilot were ever found. Joe would be posthumously awarded the Navy Cross and the Purple Heart. He had finally achieved his own fame and heroism, though he had not lived to see it. Joe Sr. grieved the loss of his firstborn son deeply, but he also realized the practical implications of his death. With Joe Jr. gone, all his aspirations shifted onto the shoulder of his younger son. Jack Kennedy would prove to be a son worthy of his father's expectations, and a grandson who would fulfill the promise his grandfather had made so many years ago. He he would pick up the mantle laid down by his fallen brother and become the transformative president known best by his iconic initials, JFK.